it's a great pleasure to be here for a variety of reasons, because it's not often that an academic like me gets to give a talk where I don't have to show lots of facts and figures and statistics and data, but where I get to talk personally. So that's what's really exciting about this opportunity is I've been here seven years, and so when I was emailed by Chris and Liz in the fall, and they said, the topic is My Arizona, and we really want you to talk about you and what gets you excited by Arizona. That's wonderful, because when you're an academic and you're talking about facts and figures and data, you're not talking about yourself and what gets you excited. So it's just really a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to give this talk. So I have a couple goals today, and the first goal is for all of us to understand how Arizona's unique landscape is what I call a continental connector for a diverse number of species. The second goal is to understand how we have rich diversity of species in this state, in this area, and that this creates a special responsibility for us here in Arizona. And then third, how Arizona is really a trendsetter and can be an example for other states, other regions in the country, and for people throughout North America in developing approaches to conserve and protect ecosystems and species. And then finally, to understand how what we do in Arizona is really important for not just us here, but for people in other parts of the United States and for people in Mexico, and how actions on one side of the border in particular can affect species and people on the other side. And I'm going to tell this today through three stories. Those stories are the jaguar and the monarch butterfly, and talking a little bit about border issues. I want to make sure the camera can see me, and does it need to see me and the slides at the same time? Okay, good. So first, before I get into stories about the jaguar and the monarch, I'd like to talk to you about Arizona as a continental connector. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the really special things about Arizona, especially southeast Arizona, is that we have four major influences. From the north, we have the influence of the Rocky Mountains. From the south, we have tropical influences that come up from Mexico. And from the east, we've got the Great Plains and the Chihuahua Desert. And then from the west, we have the Sonoran Desert. And these north-south connections in particular mean that we're really lucky here in Arizona to have some unique tropical species, like the elegant trogon, who's a relative of the quetzal. You can see its distribution goes down into Mexico and Central America. And these north-south connections mean that we also have exciting things like mountaintops and snow and alpine tundra, which makes this a perfect place for me. I started off my career as a tropical ecologist. I spent a lot of time in the South Pacific working in mangroves. That's a picture of me in Venezuela working in mangroves. And the other photo is me and my daughter, age 2.5, over Christmas in Colorado. So we also have east-west connections, and one of the important examples of these east-west connections is the monarch butterfly. Okay, good. So how many people have heard about monarchs, seen monarchs in the news this last year? Yes, a lot. Okay, great. So monarchs have mainly two populations, an eastern population east of the Rocky Mountains and a western population, and they're pretty much distinct. But what's really neat is this right here. This is us in Arizona. And so our monarchs connect the east and the west. So typically what happens in the eastern population is that the monarchs spend the winter in Mexico, and then they spend the summer and spring in the east, and then they migrate back. And then there's this western population that spends the winter in California and then spreads out through the west for breeding. And the Arizona population goes both ways. Some of them go down to Mexico for the winter, and some of them go down to out to California. And so it's a very neat. One of the neat things about Arizona is that we connect east and west as well as north and south. And this is an example here of a monarch that flew from Hereford, Arizona to Morro Bay, California. And it was tagged by the Southwest Monarch Study. So because of all of this connection, of this continental connectivity, Arizona and this region where we are is one of the 4 regions, parts of the country, parts of the world that have biodiversity, high levels of biodiversity. And it's considered by the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, to be one of the top hotspots of global biodiversity. And biodiversity, by the way, means that we have lots of plants and animal species. So we're really in a fortunate position here. And so just for an example, Arizona has 104 mammal species, 26 amphibian species, 117 reptile species, and 404 birds. So my first story is about the jaguar. Now, how many folks knew before this lecture that there's jaguar in Arizona? All right, great. Okay, so this is a photo of a male jaguar that was in a trail camera, and it was taken 2 summers ago, year and a half ago, 2013. And we have historically had quite a few jaguar in this part of the region. This map here has the historic range, which is this light color. So it went from all the way from southwestern United States to the southern part of South America. But the range has contracted, and now we just have a little bit of a finger of jaguar range into Arizona. So why do we don't have it going back to the previous, we don't have a lot of jaguar in other parts of the United States. Well, why do we have jaguar still in Arizona? We have, so what is the ideal habitat for jaguar? Well, rainforest and swamps, the pampas of South America, but also grasslands and mountain shrub. And what does that sound an awful like? It sounds like Arizona, right? So we still have a lot of good habitat, and much of it is on ranch lands and rangelands and public lands. We have so much good habitat that the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to declare what's called critical habitat. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but this is the critical habitat for what the Fish and Wildlife Service deems to be critical habitat for jaguar. And anybody want to hazard a kind of an idea about what kind of habitat this is mostly? It's not in Tucson. It's mostly in our public lands and our ranch lands throughout the state. So, as you all know, it's been in the news lately, or many of you may know, that the jaguar is an endangered species. So quickly, just a little bit of its history. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed. 1979, Fish and Wildlife said they always intended to list the jaguar. There were numerous delays and a lawsuit, and finally in 1997 it was listed. And at that point in time, Fish and Wildlife said they didn't want to declare critical habitat, to outline a location of habitat that's really important for it. Because by doing that, by saying exactly, here are maps, here's where the critical habitat is, they argued that it would increase the threat to the animal. In 2006, they got sued. And in response to that, Fish and Wildlife said critical habitat would not benefit the species. They were sued again, and then finally Fish and Wildlife said critical habitat will benefit the species. So here is the Federal Register announcement. So what does this mean, critical habitat? Critical habitat is when the Fish and Wildlife Service says there is this kind of landscape that has the most important biological and physical elements that are essential for a threatened and endangered species survival. So what does it do? It protects against modifying that habitat in a way that would adversely affect the species. It's applied to federal lands, situations where federal funding is used. For example, if a rancher has federal funding to do ranch improvements, and it also applies to public land grazing allotments. So it's a very federal thing. It applies to federal activities, federal land, and federal funding. And if in one of these conditions here, there's adverse modification, it could result in the project change or cancellation of the project. So what does it not do? It does not affect private land and private actions. It does not create refuge parks or sanctuaries, and it does not apply to existing areas where the features aren't. So this is a concern for ranchers in the area, and we were engaged some of my students and I were engaged to do a study of ranchers in the area to understand their attitudes towards conservation and jaguar. This is Professor George Rule, who's a professor of range extension, and my research technician Wendy and I, just a couple weeks ago at a workshop with ranchers in Southeast Arizona. And over the last 2 years, we've been doing interviews, and we did a survey with we surveyed every single rancher in Southeast Arizona and Southwest New Mexico who is in the critical habitat area, and we've held a series of workshops with them. This right here is Mac Donaldson, who has a ranch he owns the Empire Ranch in Patagonia, Sonoita. So ranchers in Arizona see themselves as wildlife stewards. They differentiate between the animal and the regulation. They're worried about the regulation. They're worried because now that there's a critical habitat designation, if they have a federal nexus, if they have federal funding, or if they have a public allotment, they could be impacted. They could possibly be sued. Their grazing permits could be hampered. And they would also like the general public here in Arizona to know that they have an important role as environmental stewards. And this gets to one of the main goals of my talk, is to point out how ranchers in Arizona really are trendsetters in environmental protection and collaborative conservation. So I wonder, a number of you probably, I know Frank has heard, and probably Rick, of the Malpai Borderlands Group. Anybody else heard of them? Good. So they're a collaborative group of ranchers in the Douglas area, and they've worked to protect 78,000 acres of private land with easements. They developed a compensation program for jaguar depredation, and they've taken a number of actions to protect endangered species, including leopard frogs and long-nosed bat. Closer here to home in Tucson is the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, which has worked to put 200,000 acres in Pima County's conservation land system. And then is Richard, are you here, Richard Collins? Richard said he would be here. He's a rancher, until recently ranched just south of Tucson, and has been engaged in working on endangered species on the top minnow. And also, ranchers, in addition to working together collaboratively with agencies and environmentalists, have actually participated in the studies that are proving that we have jaguar here right now. So all these photos that you've seen, the previous photo of the jaguar, this is an ocelot, come from the UA's cat monitoring project, where 250 sites have been surveyed with trail cameras, 2 cameras in each site, to look for and try to identify wildlife in the area. And many of these sites have either been on private ranch land or on grazing allotments with rancher collaboration. And they range from the Babaquivari to the Peloncillo Mountains. 117 photos have been taken of a single jaguar male, and then 12 photos have been taken of ocelots. So to sum up the jaguar story, Arizona has really very impressive on a global scale. We have a very impressive amount of biodiversity, and this creates responsibilities for all of us in Arizona to protect this under the legal framework of the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of these responsibilities fall particularly heavily on a small subset of us here in southern Arizona. But also, Arizonans are pioneering very collaborative approaches to rangeland and large landscape conservation. And this is a really important message that I want to take into the next story, which is Arizona and the monarch butterflies. This is a picture here taken by JB, one of JB right here in front of a freshly emergent monarch in the San Rafael Valley last summer. Oh, you can't hear me in the back? Okay, well, I think it's as loud, so I just have to talk. Okay. And so I want to remind you that Arizona is what we call a continental connector for monarchs. Arizona monarchs go to Mexico and they go to California. And monarchs have been in the news. I think most of you have heard about that. Why have they been in the news? Because their populations are rapidly declining. This is a graphic from the WWF that shows that they've declined from 2013 to 2003. The monarch populations in the east are measured in terms of how many monarchs there are in Mexico, and the decline has been from 27.48 acres to 1.65 acres. This is another graph that is showing the decline, but over a longer period of time from 1994 to 2013. The last count was just held last month. We had 1.13 hectares of monarchs. Why am I talking about monarchs in hectares? Anybody know, and not in numbers? They're kind of hard to count, right? And so how people count them is how many hectares of monarchs there are clustered, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. So this is a very impressive decline, and one of the things is even when the monarch rebounds, when the numbers rebound, here there were 7.8 and they rebounded to 20. The rebounds after declines are getting smaller and smaller and smaller over time. This is a photograph of the monarchs clustered in the Oyamel fir forest in central Mexico and their overwintering sites. And why are they declining? Well, for a long time we thought it was illegal logging in Mexico, and it probably was. There was a lot of large-scale, illegal, but yet very organized and almost corporative logging in Mexico, and that logging has pretty much stopped. Mexico's really cracked down on that. So what logging there is right now is pretty much small scale, individual people. If you notice right here, this is kind of orange. What are those? Why is it orange? That's the monarchs right there. So what's really going on? Well, in order to understand what's really going on with the monarchs, we can't just look to Mexico. We have to look at their entire life cycle, their entire migration, and their needs. This is a graph that I'm going to signal out. Roshana, where are you there? Will you raise your hand? Dr. Roshana Wiederholt is a research scientist in my group. She's been putting this map together. She's developing a model of monarch migration. And what happens is that monarchs migrate in several generations. So the first generation leaves Mexico at the end of the winter. They head to southern Texas, southern United States, even here to northern Mexico. They breed, and then the next generation goes up into the Midwest, and then some of them head to the Northeast. And then that generation breeds, goes through its whole life cycle, and then there is often a fourth generation, here sometimes fourth and fifth generations. Then at the end of the fall, they come back to the south, and then they head back to Mexico. So as many as 5 different generations. The monarchs that left Mexico don't come back. It's their great-great-grandkids who come back. And each of these steps is an entire life cycle. So it starts off as a little, I don't know, yeah, I didn't want to use the technical term. I was going to say egg, but, and then it becomes a caterpillar, and then it forms a chrysalis, and it hatches. And each of these stages, the monarchs, well, at the first stage, the monarchs they have a particular need, and that's the milkweed plant. They need that milkweed plant in order to lay their eggs, and then as food for the caterpillar stage. And then at the next stage, at the butterfly stage, they need nectar plants in order to feed off of. Okay, so what's going on? Well, some of those needs are not being met as they migrate. So what's happening in the Midwest is that we've got more acres under crop production than ever before. This is a graph here that Gary Nabhan put together that shows monarch population declines over time, the increase in acreage in corn over time, and then also the increase in glyphosate. So I'll talk about that in a second. So over time, we've had more acres under crop production. Since 2007, 30% loss of acreage in the Conservation Reserve Program, which was a federal incentive program to keep land out of production and in kind of intact prairie habitat. We've got increased use of glyphosate. Anybody here know the commercial name for glyphosate? Roundup. Okay, so Roundup is it's an herbicide produced by, anybody know? Monsanto. And farmers in the Midwest have been starting to use it. because they want to kill the weeds, have more space for corn production, and that glyphosate is killing, quotes, weeds, but those weeds include monarchs and the nectar plants. In addition, we also wonder and suspect that there could be an increase in predation, other pesticides impacting the monarchs. There's a non-native milkweed that you can buy very easily in garden centers that actually causes problems for the monarchs. It gets them off timing, so it's actually detrimental. Folks are planting it thinking they're doing something good, and it's causing problems. And as well as it could be possibly climate change issues. So, but the general consensus is right now that we really need to focus on the lack of milkweed and nectar plants in Midwestern farmscapes. And this is a farmscape from Illinois. So just to pull out kind of a couple statistics here, from 1992 to 2012, it's estimated that we have had a 64% decline in milkweed in the Midwest, with a 90% decline in milkweed in Iowa. All right, so personal story. Many of you probably didn't know this, but the Hoffmans were for 4 generations, this is my dad's side, Iowa corn farmers. This is a picture of my grandfather's uncle, Ernie. At that point in time, they farmed with horses, and this is an Iowa landscape. Not exactly the farm, my grandfather's farm, but pretty nearby. My grandfather was really impacted, and I'm telling this story to illustrate what's going on in the Midwest, by a story that he'd heard. In the late 1800s, the family's entire corn crop ended up in a stream because his grandfather had plowed in straight rows. So a big rainstorm came and the entire crop ended up in a stream. And they talked about his grandfather just standing there crying because the family was going to go hungry that year. So the Hoffmans became very innovative. They were some of the first people to do contour plowing so that there wouldn't be such direct erosion. They actually left strips of prairie grass so that could catch that erosion. But my grandfather was also an extension agent and part of the Green Revolution. And so he was really into the chemicals and the fertilizers, and those prairie strips that he left intact to catch erosion, he sprayed. My dad at age 10, 8, 9, and 10 was spraying DDT. So I called my dad this morning, and I just was asking him about this. I said, you know, grandfather was really an innovator in terms of soil conservation, but did you think about wildlife? And my dad's quote was that his dad was focused on soil conservation, not wildlife habitat. So I guess that's just sort of a true confession that my family has played a role in creating this problem that we've got today. So moving on about monarchs. Monarchs are listed in Mexico as a species of special protection, not as an endangered species, which means they don't really have very much protection. In last summer, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to list monarchs as endangered in the U.S. They evaluated that petition. It said it had some merit, and so they're spending a year studying the issue. And my research group, which we work a lot, Roshana and I and others work a lot with the USGS through the Powell Center. And so we're doing a number of things right now. Roshana's modeling the population dynamics. Some of us are also engaging in what's called a population viability analysis to look at what the extinction threats are. Roshana's doing a multiple threat analysis to try to figure out how much is glyphosate, how much is loss of CRP habitat. We're developing a public tool that anybody could use for the entire United States, and it's going to include Mexico, that would say, okay, how many acres do we need here of X milkweed density or nectar plant density? And we're working as fast as possible to prepare these results for the trilateral meeting of U.S., Canadian, and Mexican Fish and Wildlife agencies. Okay, so I've been talking about the Midwest and Iowa, and my Iowa grandfather farmer for a while, and some of you I bet are wondering, what in the world does this have to do with Arizona? What is Arizona's role? Well, here's a map of milkweed diversity. If you guys can see down here, what is this? This is where we are. This is Pima County. This is West Arizona, Southeast Arizona, and Cochise County. We have the highest numbers of milkweed species in the country. So what is our role? Well, we're not going to save monarchs. We don't have enough habitat here, but what we do is we have agricultural practices that maintain habitat for monarchs and other species. This is another of Joe's pictures here of the San Rafael Valley with lots of nectar flowers. And our ranchers, you've seen this slide before, our ranchers are used to working on conservation issues. They're used to collaborating with each other. They're used to developing strategies like compensation programs when there's an endangered species that could cause them a loss. They're used to working together over endangered species issues. I have a very, very good colleague named Laura Jackson from the University of Northern Iowa. She's the premier prairie restoration expert, and she says, you guys don't know how lucky you are in Arizona. You've got great habitat, and you all know how to work together. And we need to learn from you as we move forward. So, to sum up the wildlife story, Arizona is not going to do anything to save monarchs. We don't have enough habitat. But as wildlife managers and citizens in the U.S. and Mexico and Canada to a lesser extent work together to figure out how to arrest further population declines, they're going to be learning from Arizona about how our trend-setting practices for collaborating and for maintaining habitat. And I'm almost certain that some of our ranchers here are going to be consulting and visiting folks in the Midwest to talk about how they've dealt with some endangered species issues. All right, so the fourth goal of this talk and the last segment of it is to talk about the transborder issues. I've worked a lot on the transborder issues, and one of my goals with my research is to show how actions on one side of the border can affect species and their cultural benefits on other sides. So I've been talking about monarchs a lot, sort of in general, but I haven't really zeroed in on why we all care about them. Folks in the United States really do care about monarchs. They provide a lot of cultural benefits. This first photo here is of monarchs being released at weddings. It's quite popular. It's actually not good because those monarchs kind of get in the mix with the natural ones, and it doesn't always work out so well. But it's a popular thing to do. People like that. Anybody recognize this right here? What's this? It's exactly, so the Michoacan Morelia football team, you know, these guys are really good football, soccer. Okay, sorry. For me, it's football. They're called the Monarchs. This is a male, macho football team, and they're called the Monarcas. Here's a little boy. Monarchs are one of the most popular kind of outdoor education kinds of activities in the United States. And then, of course, lots of folks get pleasure from, and my pointers, okay, from planting monarchs in their backyards. So a couple years ago now, this research team did a survey. We surveyed 2,300 people across the United States, stratified by region and by income to figure out, do they care about monarchs? Do they know about monarchs? Would they be willing to pay for monarch conservation? And we came up with, a one-time willingness to donate for habitat to maintain monarch habitat of $3.4 to $5 billion. And then when we asked them how much money have you spent or how much would you be willing to spend to protect monarchs, that number went up to almost $6 billion. That's a lot of money. But here was what was really exciting for me as somebody who thinks cross borders. They weren't just willing to spend money in their own location. They realized that monarchs are migratory species, that there could be impacts across borders. So take a look at this graph here shows how it's just a kind of a visual way of representing how practice in the United States and Canada can impact monarchs' population dynamics in Mexico, and how deforestation in Mexico can impact population dynamics in US and Canada. And amazingly enough, people who never really thought in this way got it. So here, this graph here, it's a little bit complicated. It's 4 sections. And what we did here is we divided the population into, we looked at 4 different main regions. And I'd like you to focus in on this one right here. So this is the upper Midwest. People in the upper Midwest were willing to spend on average household $5.6 $1.74 to protect monarchs in their region, but they were willing to also spend money to protect monarchs in other locations. So $4 for the eastern area, they were willing to send $4 to California, or $3.79 to California, and then even money to Mexico. And that was the first time for a migratory species like that anybody had ever showed that people were willing that the people generally recognize these cross-border things and were willing to put money on the table to protect species. Okay, so I'm about ready to finish my talk and ready for questions, but I can't wrap up without talking a little bit about the border fence. As you can see, I'm really excited about Arizona. I'm excited about our role in terms of having lots of biodiversity. I feel that we're doing great things that can be used to develop collaborative approaches to conservation in Mexico as well as in the Midwest. But we all know that we have this border fence. And some of you may know that about 5, 6, 7 years ago, I was part of a team of scientists who were asked to put together a protocol for understanding the impacts of the border fence, border wall, and border security on the environment here in the environment, and not just in southern Arizona, but throughout the entire range of border security across the border. And we were going to look at the impacts of the symbol of the border security on cross-border collaboration, as well as looking at the impacts on species movement for big species and small species like this one. And we weren't able to proceed with that project, which was a real disappointment. So I knew when I was invited by Chris and Liz to give this talk that I was going to have to address this issue. 5 or 6 years ago, I was terribly disappointed. It's unprecedented that a project that large and there's no environmental impact analysis. NEPA, Endangered Species Act, all of those acts were waived. And so what we've had to date are small studies in small locations, but no comprehensive study across the border. So I thought to myself, okay, somebody at this talk is going to ask me about that. What in the world am I going to say? And last month, my family went down to Nogales. This is my daughter, Julia. She's 2.5 years old. And as you can see, she didn't make it through the border fence, the border wall. She took a look, she stuck her arms through, she couldn't get through it. And then what did she do? She saw some people on the other side. And she said to them first in English, some kids, she said, "Hi boys, hi Julia." When that didn't work, she switched gears, and in Spanish she said, "Hola chachos, yo Julia." And so for me that represents what we have been doing here in Arizona. We haven't let the border wall stop us. We've kept thinking about the role of Arizona as a continental connector, appreciating the important biodiversity that we have here, understanding that it has impacts, but also and creates responsibilities, but also creates opportunities for us. And so we've kept working. So in conclusion, My Arizona connects us throughout North America. It connects species, and via our species, it connects us culturally. We are a trendsetter in collaborative conservation and in figuring out ways to make agricultural landscapes protect habitat. We're doing a lot of great things, and I really appreciate the opportunity here to tell you, I'm getting goosebumps about how excited I am about what all we've been doing. And so a talk like this for somebody like me is a wonderful opportunity, because you don't often get the opportunity to sit back and say, okay, what am I excited about? And so thank you very much, Liz and Chris and others in geography, for inviting me here today to give this talk. I also want to thank you. I probably missed people, but thank the folks who lent me their photographs, and then I'd be happy to take questions.